Welcome to the University of Nottingham and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. One of the great problems that faces anyone dealing with the period of about 2,000 years ago is how the religion Christianity emerges within another religion, Judaism. We tend to think of them as two utterly distinct religions, or as one branching out of the other. But the reality was far more complex than this. I work on early Christianity, and with me is Dr. Holger Zellentin, who works on the Judaism of that period. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Tom.
Holger, there's always a danger when you go into class and you're dealing with 2,000 years ago and you draw a line called Judaism, and then you call a branch called Christianity, and then students think of two branches of a tree, and it's a very simple model. How much more complicated is it?
How much more complicated? Well, quite a bit more. I think the first question to ask would be, where does the tree start? And there is a tendency, and has always been a tendency, to perceive of Judaism, of Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that produced the Talmud, the Judaism that still informs Jewish practice today, there's a tendency to connect this directly to ancient Israel. Now, this is partially justified. The rabbis did read the Bible. They did think a lot about the temple, about Moses, about the laws given in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, that is. But at the same time, the earliest rabbinic text that we have, the earliest text that resembles anything that we can call Judaism in the rabbinic sense, has been edited around the year 210, 220. Now, Common Era, so rather late. Now, all these rabbinic texts and the Christian texts as well have, I would say, were complicit in giving the impression that this rabbinic Judaism actually has very, very deep roots. And undoubtedly, roots are there. The question, though, is how can they be verified by a historian? And I think that the Christians did have a need to portray the rabbis as almost as the Pharisees, as the Jewish leaders that were around in Jesus' time, because for the Christians it was important to have an interlocutor to point to and to say that, well, these are the Jews, look, we're doing things differently. And the rabbis at the same time, they of course were very much eager to establish their own antiquity and to populate the Second Temple period, the period before Jesus, with rabbis, because they used the authority of tradition. They told an unbroken narrative from Moses to themselves. Now, what's interesting, if you look at that, this narrative, this continuity, becomes stronger the later you go in time. So rabbis in the 3rd century did not much bother about continuity. They assumed it was logical for them that what they were doing was what people before them were doing. If you look at later rabbis, though, they started inventing narratives. How many rabbis did run the show in the temple, and they emphasized more and more that tradition. So we do see, I think, here a joint project of rabbis and Christians to establish Jewish antiquity. But for the historian, Rabbinic Judaism starts verifiably in the early 3rd century. We can trace it, of course, a little bit earlier, but we cannot directly connect it to ancient Israel without problematizing that question.
Well, there's an interesting variant on that in the 2nd century of the Common Era, in that sometime between, say, 100 Common Era and the Second Revolt in 132, our writing was produced in Hebrew, though it doesn't survive in Hebrew, which is the kernel of a book called 4 Esdras. By 180, that book is being quoted as authoritative Old Testament by Christian writers in Greek. And in the intervening period, we find that the original kernel written before the Second Revolt was written by someone who knew nothing about Jesus and wasn't interested in Jesus at all. So we will call him a Jew, in inverted commas. It was then taken over, translated into Greek. It may have been translated by someone who isn't a follower of Jesus into Greek, but certainly it's translated into Greek. It gets a Christian beginning and a Christian ending, and in this larger form, it is being quoted as Old Testament, in other words, pre-Jesus scripture in 180. And what that says to me is that for most of the 2nd century, the lines between these two religions that we think of as very distinct, they're reading one another's texts, and the texts can move freely between one another. And that indicates to me, since texts always move within traditions, someone copying and valuing and copying again, that, say by 150, 160, the lines cannot yet be clearly drawn. Would that be a fair way of saying it?
It is certainly a fair way of saying it, and I think the period that you mentioned, the 2nd century, the period between the first revolt around 70 and the second revolt around 130, is the period I think that is would be the most interesting to study, and it is at the same time the period which is most obscure in Jewish studies. We have many Hellenistic texts, Hellenistic Jewish texts from the 1st century. We have Josephus most of all. We have some parts of the New Testament, I would say, belong just as much to the Jewish tradition, Revelations, for example, perhaps the Gospel of Matthew. But we have a host of Hellenistic Jewish texts in the 1st century, and then in the period leading up to the Bar Kokhba revolt, and especially after, we just have silence. And it's an eerie silence, to be sure, if we look at the historical record of how much devastation was done to Judea by the Romans. So it might be that the people who were producing text were either displaced or dead. And then when we look at the rabbinic track record of publication, if you put it in these simplistic terms, the fact that the rabbis seem to have reorganized after the Bar Kokhba revolt and have then reorganized in a way that was distinctly rabbinic, I think does answer your question in as far as the earliest rabbinic texts, the Mishnah and also the Tosefta that goes along with the Mishnah, also redacted in the early 3rd century, does have some traces of an anti-Christian narrative already. It's not central, but it's there. You do get a slant here against Jesus and a little bit there, and you have a very clear emphasis on practice, which I would say is what differentiates in the long run Judaism from Christianity.
And in that period of eerie silence between the two revolts, you do get among texts that would later be seen as core Christian texts some interesting reflections. Like, for instance, in the Gospel of John, let's say very late 1st century, 90, 100, you hear this thing, the mob of the Jews. So already you're hearing a distinguishing narrative between the group who are valuing and hearing this gospel and those other people, the Jews. So you're beginning to see a pulling apart on the Christian side. You also have this other very strange thing. Luke, writing in Acts, and again, probably in the first or second decade of the 2nd century, he has this famous phrase, the Christianoi, the Christians. Now, of course, he puts it into the situation that it's in Caesarea Philippi, or is it in Caesarea Maritima? I can't remember which. It's in Caesarea that the followers of Jesus, the followers of the way, are called for the first times Christianoi. But it's probably a situation that the very fact that it's Ianoi, it's that Latin form masquerading as Greek, it means they're being seen as a political party, a sect within a larger group. That probably means that they're being labelled as a subset of Judaism by outsiders. And the question is, what does that tell us about Jewish and Christian self-definition?
I think it tells us a lot about a shifting line of demarcation. It tells us about a shifting self-identity. And I think the mistake that is often repeated and even by historians is to see things too simply. Things were very different locally. Things took different shape at different places. A separation between Judaism and Christianity cannot even be conceived of in historical terms, because it presupposes the idea that you know what you're talking about, and we simply don't. We know that there are many local forms of Jewish worship. We know that in many local aspects there was also belief in Jesus. We know that there was a battle, how important Jesus was. But at the same time, we cannot say that anything like that should be called Christianity or Judaism in those simple terms, because the people even themselves didn't call themselves that. And I think there is many a Jew or many a Christian that would be quite offended by our labeling them, and rightfully so, because it is so simple to conceive of the world in these grand narratives. But whenever you look at precisely, you see individuals making tough decisions, but also committing to a form of life that cannot fit our category so simply.
One of the characteristics of religious narratives is that they tend to want to focus back on this pristine moment in the past when everything fitted together and there was a complete harmony of doctrine, practice, ideas. And for Christians, that tends to be the time of Jesus. There is a perfect time, and you must be able to trace everything back to that instantaneous moment. And a vast amount of certainly for 500 years, most study of early Christianity has been focused on trying to get back to this perfect, pristine moment when everything was orthodox, everything was perfectly organized. We both know that that doesn't work, because you only have to read any two New Testament documents to see differences in practice, differences in outlook, differences in theology, different ways of presenting who Jesus was, different ways of looking at the past. What you're saying is that there is a parallel process going on in 3rd century Judaism of trying to create a perfect past.
That's correct and different. Both the rabbis have this long-standing tradition of relating themselves directly to Moses, and I think even later they even start developing the idea that even the Talmud itself, what they're producing day to day, was already given back on Sinai. What a rabbinic pupil would utter was actually revealed before. Obviously, they are well aware of the stark contrast in here. So there is this sense of relating everything to Sinai, which is one tendency, but there's yet another one, and that is the foundation moment. And this the rabbis do relate at the very eve of the destruction of the Second Temple. They do start telling a story rather late, it's a 4th century story, of how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fled Jerusalem. Now, if you look at the historical iterations of that story, it does become the foundation narrative of Rabbinic Judaism rather late in the Babylonian Talmud in the 5th, 6th century. There's a previous version in the Palestinian tradition which already tells a very similar narrative, and the moment really is more about the continuity, about bringing the truth out of Jerusalem to the Rabbinic Academy.
There is actually an exact parallel to that in Christianity, in that Christianity has the moment of Jesus, but certainly Western Christianity also needs to establish Peter in Rome. And so you have to bring Christianity from the Near East into the very center of the empire, and then everything goes back. So, the moment the Prince of the Apostles moves into Rome, an event for which we have no historical evidence at all, and indeed we know there were many bishops of Rome simultaneously for the first several centuries, that becomes the moment equivalent to that's when the link is forged between the perfect moment and the perfect beginning of the tradition.
And it seems that the longer time goes on, the more precisely the traditions become about what happened in the past. It is, as people start forgetting, it is easier to tell a story.
Oh yes, and of course, in a sense, the task that we face as scholars is to remember the very first lecture that you always give to historians. Please don't engage in anachronism. Read a text and try to see the world of the text and try to enter the world of that text rather than to import that text into your own world.
Absolutely, and I think the lesson here to be learned is not to simply dismiss these old narratives as meaningless. They're far from that. They're very, very meaningful, but they need to be read in their own time. And I think that is really a historian's task, to engage a text on its own terms. And when we take, for example, the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and contextualize it in the 4th century,
Yes.
we learn that, well, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was supposed to have lived in the 1st century, but we don't know much about him. If you read him as the story as a 4th century narrative, you see all of a sudden this very rich world of Christian-Jewish polemic. You have an engagement, I would say, with Christian destruction narratives. You have an engagement with Josephus. This Palestinian story is later retold in the Babylonian Talmud, and here all of a sudden you have yet a different Babylonian context, rabbinic context. You see the rabbis engaging with their own history. You see them criticizing the Palestinian rabbis, and you see them all again, and all this richness, I would say, can only come to the forefront of a historian's skilled reading that tries to engage the text on its own terms.
And equally to ask the question, why is the narrative of the perfect moment of Jesus and the perfect moment of Peter in Rome, why are those narratives important and why are they valued?
And again, I think there's simple answers and complex ones. The simple answer is to establish a tradition, to answer charges. And I think in the case of the rabbis, there were Christian charges that needed to be answered. That's very clear. But at the same time, it is these founding moments are the ideal examples to tell what you value, what's important. For example, Yochanan ben Zakkai, he goes a very fine line between accommodating the Roman occupation, for example, and establishing rabbinic wisdom, and establishing the proper practice of Torah, establishing the proper religious form. He does have quite a strict attitude against people who would rely on prophecy or would rely on personal inspiration. He says, no, we can't do that. That's actually what Christians do, I would say, between the lines. But the text says clearly, this is not prophecy, this is Torah learning. The Torah itself in these narratives comes to the forefront and shows a new rabbinic way of dealing with the world based on scripture, based on hermeneutics, based on rabbinic culture. So if you then go back and you read these documents as foundation documents fully on these terms, but within a different context than the one they claim from coming, then I think you can gain a genuine understanding of what Rabbinic Judaism is. And they do become foundation narratives and true foundation narratives in a very different way.
Holger, this is a long conversation. We will have to pick it up later and try and look at more foundation narratives. But for now, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.